From milk baths that turned to cheese to DeMille literally chasing actors down Hollywood Boulevard, Cecil B. DeMille's 1932 biblical epic The Sign of the Cross hides some of Hollywood's most bizarre behind-the-scenes secrets. This pre-code sensation shocked audiences with its depravity, inadvertently sparked a Catholic censorship organization, and featured everything from belly button removal to theaters accepting IOUs during the Great Depression. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Sign of the Cross. Fact 1. The milk bath turned into cheese. One of the most iconic and scandalous scenes in The Sign of the Cross is the moment when Claudette Colbert, playing the wicked Empress Poppaea, bathes completely nude in what was supposed to be ass's milk. The scene took several days to film, and what happened behind the scenes was far less glamorous than what audiences saw on screen. Director Cecil B. DeMille announced to the press with great fanfare that real ass's milk was being used for authenticity, but the truth was quite different. The production actually filled the enormous bathtub with powdered cow's milk mixed with water, which was much cheaper and easier to obtain than the real thing. The problems began almost immediately. Because the filming stretched over multiple days, the milk mixture had to sit in the tub overnight under the intense heat of the studio lights. By the second day of shooting, the milk had turned sour and began to congeal, transforming into something that resembled cream cheese. The smell became absolutely unbearable. Colbert herself later recalled that the stench was so overwhelming she nearly fainted while trying to complete her scenes. She had to spend hours in the pool each day, and her bangs even came uncurled from the warmth of the spoiled milk. Despite the disgusting conditions, Colbert remained professional and completed the filming. The scene became one of the most famous moments in pre-code Hollywood history, shocking audiences who had no idea that the glamorous star was actually suffering through a nightmare of sour, cheese-like milk while the cameras rolled. The two kittens added to the scene to prove the milk was real probably had the worst time of all. Fact 2. Claudette Colbert's belly button was removed. In one of the strangest acts of censorship in Hollywood history, film editors actually removed Claudette Colbert's belly button from The Sign of the Cross. During the notorious bathing scene where Colbert appears nude as Empress Poppaea, censors decided that showing her navel was too explicit for audiences, so they painstakingly edited it out of the film frame by frame. The result was bizarrely unnatural, leaving Colbert with a smooth, featureless stomach that made her look anatomically impossible. Years later, Colbert herself commented on this absurd alteration with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. She remarked that they had removed her belly button from the film and asked if anyone had ever seen a tummy without a navel, noting how very weird it looked. The editing process was incredibly tedious for the time, requiring technicians to manually paint over her navel in each individual frame where it appeared visible. This level of censorship shows just how far authorities would go to sanitize films, even when the changes created something far more strange and unnatural than what was originally filmed. The irony was that audiences could see Colbert nearly completely nude in the scene, but the censors drew the line at her belly button. In the restored version of the film that exists today, Colbert's natural anatomy has been preserved, allowing modern viewers to see the scene as it was originally shot. The belly button removal remains one of the most peculiar examples of pre-code era censorship, demonstrating how arbitrary and inconsistent the rules could be when it came to what was considered acceptable for audiences to see on screen. Fact 3. DeMille chased John Carradine down Hollywood Boulevard. The way John Carradine got cast in The Sign of the Cross is one of the most unusual casting stories in Hollywood history. In 1932, Carradine was a struggling, unemployed actor trying to make ends meet during the Great Depression. One day, director Cecil B. DeMille was walking down Hollywood Boulevard when he heard an incredibly powerful, booming voice that stopped him in his tracks. The voice belonged to Carradine, who was simply walking down the street, likely talking to someone or perhaps projecting his voice as actors often did to stay in practice. DeMille was so impressed by the sheer quality and resonance of Carradine's voice that he immediately started chasing after him down the busy boulevard. The legendary director ran down the street until he finally caught up with the surprised actor, who had no idea why this famous filmmaker was pursuing him. DeMille introduced himself and offered Carradine work on the spot. This chance encounter on Hollywood Boulevard launched a professional relationship that would span 5 films between the two men. In The Sign of the Cross specifically, Carradine ended up playing multiple roles, showcasing his versatility as a performer. He appeared as a Christian martyr being led to his execution in the arena, voiced the leader of the gladiators, and provided several other voices throughout the crowd scenes. Sharp-eyed viewers can spot him ascending the dungeon stairs to his death, and his distinctive voice can be heard calling out the famous line, "We who are about to die salute you," to Emperor Nero. What started as an accidental meeting on a Hollywood street became a significant opportunity for Carradine during one of the toughest economic periods in American history. Fact 4. Theaters accepted IOUs during the bank holiday. The Sign of the Cross had one of the most unusual theatrical releases in cinema history due to timing that couldn't have been worse, or perhaps more fitting given the film's themes. When the movie opened nationally on February 10, 1933, the country was in the absolute depths of the Great Depression, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt had just declared a bank holiday. This meant that every single bank in the United States was closed to prevent a complete collapse of the banking system, and people had no access to their money. For most businesses, this would have meant shutting down completely, but theater managers across the country came up with a creative solution. They decided to accept handwritten IOUs, which were essentially promises to pay scribbled on little pieces of paper as payment for admission to see the film. Patrons who desperately wanted to see the movie but had no cash in their pockets could write out these unsecured notes promising to pay later, and theater managers trusted them enough to let them in. It was an extraordinary act of faith in their customers during one of the most economically uncertain times in American history. Cecil B. DeMille himself later reported on this phenomenon in his autobiography, noting that he was amazed by how theater managers handled the situation. Even more remarkably, DeMille stated that nearly every single one of those IOUs was eventually redeemed once the banks reopened and cash started flowing through the economy again. This unusual arrangement demonstrated both the desperate desire audiences had to escape their troubles through entertainment and the surprising level of trust and community spirit that existed even during the worst economic crisis the nation had ever faced. Fact 5. Charles Laughton wore a prosthetic nose. As Nero, Charles Laughton's portrayal of Emperor Nero in The Sign of the Cross became legendary, but what many viewers don't realize is that he wore a large prosthetic nose throughout his entire performance. The fake nose was a significant piece of makeup that dramatically altered Laughton's appearance and became an integral part of how he constructed his character. This was Laughton's first American film after Cecil B. DeMille saw him performing on stage in London and recruited him for the role, so the actor was making bold choices to establish himself in Hollywood. The prosthetic nose contributed to Laughton's campy, effeminate portrayal of the corrupt emperor, helping him create one of the most memorable villains in pre-code cinema. He combined the artificial nose with sniveling, whining mannerisms and played Nero as pure effeminate evil, creating a character who was both grotesque and strangely compelling to watch. The nose helped emphasize Nero's decadence and corruption, making him appear even more bloated and self-indulgent as he lounged on his throne at bizarre angles, sucked his thumb, and watched Rome burn while playing his lyre. Despite appearing in only 4 scenes throughout the film, Laughton's performance was so powerful and scene-stealing that he became one of the most talked about elements of the movie. Critics and audiences alike were captivated by his interpretation, which would later influence other actors playing Roman emperors, including Peter Ustinov's Oscar-nominated turn as Nero in Quo Vadis nearly 20 years later. The prosthetic nose remains a fascinating detail that shows how committed Laughton was to creating an unforgettable characterization, using every tool available, including physical transformation, to bring the Mad Emperor to life. Fact 6. Mary Pickford. Originally owned the film rights before Cecil B. DeMille ever made the Sign of the Cross, the film rights to the 1895 play by Wilson Barrett were owned by none other than Mary Pickford, one of the biggest stars of the silent film era and a powerful figure in Hollywood. Pickford had purchased the rights years earlier, but never moved forward with producing a film version herself, likely because the dark religious subject matter didn't match her established screen persona as America's sweetheart. In 1932, DeMille was in a desperate situation professionally. His career was in serious trouble after a string of unsuccessful films at MGM, and no studio wanted to take a chance on him. He was even being pursued by the IRS for tax problems, and it looked like his days as a major filmmaker might be over. DeMille had an idea to adapt The Sign of the Cross, a play he had seen as a young boy and never forgotten, but he needed to acquire the rights first. He approached Pickford and paid her $38,000 for the property, which was a substantial sum during the Depression. Everyone in Hollywood told DeMille he was making a terrible mistake, insisting that audiences wanted light, fluffy entertainment to escape their troubles, not a heavy religious epic about Christian persecution in ancient Rome. The project seemed doomed from the start, especially given the economic climate. However, DeMille was willing to bet everything on this film, even putting up half the production budget out of his own pocket to convince Paramount to back the project. The gamble paid off spectacularly as the film became a massive hit and completely revived DeMille's career, establishing him once again as one of Hollywood's premier directors. Fact 7. DeMille used prism lenses to double crowd sizes. Cecil B. DeMille was famous for creating epic spectacles with massive crowd scenes, but The Sign of the Cross was made during the worst years of the Great Depression when budgets were extremely tight. The entire production had to be completed for just $650,000, which was a fraction of what DeMille usually spent on his biblical epics. To create the illusion of thousands of people filling the Colosseum and other grand Roman locations, cinematographer Carl Struss came up with an ingenious technical solution using special prism lenses. These optical devices were attached to the camera and worked by essentially duplicating and multiplying the image of the extras who were actually present on set. When filming crowd scenes, Struss would use the prism lenses to make it appear as if there were twice as many people as were really there, creating impressive shots of massive audiences without having to hire and costume thousands of additional performers. The technique was so effective that audiences had no idea they were watching an optical illusion rather than genuine crowds of extras. This clever use of camera trickery allowed DeMille to maintain his signature grand visual style even while working under severe financial constraints. The prism lens trick was just one of many cost-saving measures the production employed, but it was perhaps the most successful in terms of preserving the epic feel that audiences expected from a DeMille picture. The film's ability to look so lavish and expensive while actually being made quite cheaply became a point of pride for the director and his crew, proving that creativity and technical innovation could triumph over limited resources and create something that appeared far more expensive than it actually was. Fact 8. Production ran out of money. Mid-filming, one of the most dramatic moments during the making of The Sign of the Cross happened right in the middle of filming when the production literally ran out of money. Cecil B. DeMille was directing a scene with cameras rolling and actors performing when his assistant director Roy Burns quietly approached him and whispered that the budget had been completely exhausted. There was no money left to continue shooting, pay the crew, or complete any additional scenes that might have been planned. DeMille's response was immediate and decisive. Without hesitation, he yelled, "Cut!" to stop the scene they were filming and then announced that production was wrapping immediately. Just like that, filming on The Sign of the Cross was over, whether the movie was complete or not. DeMille then turned to his longtime editor, Anne Balkins, who had worked with him on numerous films, and gave her what must have seemed like an impossible task. He told her to take whatever footage they had managed to shoot and make it work as a finished film. Balkins had no choice but to figure out how to assemble all the existing footage into a coherent story, filling in any gaps or missing pieces through creative editing techniques. The fact that she succeeded is a testament to both her skill as an editor and the strength of what DeMille had managed to capture before the money ran out. The finished film shows no obvious signs of this abrupt ending to production, and audiences had no idea that the movie they were watching had been assembled from whatever footage happened to exist when the budget dried up, making Bauchen's work even more impressive. Fact 9. This film sparked the Catholic Legion of Decency. The Sign of the Cross holds a unique and controversial place in film history because it was one of the primary films that directly led to the formation of the Catholic Legion of Decency in 1934. This powerful organization was created specifically to identify and combat what the Catholic Church considered objectionable content in motion pictures. And it would go on to influence American cinema for decades. While there were other scandalous pre-code films being released during this period, The Sign of the Cross became a particular target of religious authorities because of its unusual combination of elements. The film depicted explicit nudity, graphic violence, and sexually suggestive content, but it did so within the framework of a religious story about early Christians being persecuted in ancient Rome. This mixing of sacred and profane content was deeply troubling to Catholic leaders, who felt that the film exploited religious themes as an excuse to show depravity and sin on screen. The notorious scenes that drew the most criticism included Claudette Colbert's nude bathing sequence, the suggestive lesbian dance performed to seduce a Christian woman, and the extended arena sequences showing Christians being torn apart by wild animals in graphic detail. Catholic authorities argued that while the film supposedly celebrated Christian martyrdom and faith, it actually spent far more time reveling in the wickedness and debauchery of pagan Rome. The reaction to The Sign of the Cross, along with another controversial film called Ann Vickers, released around the same time, pushed the Catholic Church to take organized action. The formation of the Legion of Decency marked a turning point in Hollywood censorship, as the organization began rating films and encouraging Catholics to boycott movies they deemed morally objectionable, fundamentally changing how studios approached content in their films. Fact 10. Costumes were recycled from 1923's The Ten Commandments. When Cecil B. DeMille began planning The Sign of the Cross during the depths of the Great Depression, he faced the challenge of creating an epic biblical spectacle with very limited resources. One of the most significant cost-saving measures came from an unexpected source in Paramount's own storage facilities. The studio had been holding on to elaborate costumes and standing sets from DeMille's 1923 silent film The Ten Commandments, which had been one of the most expensive and lavish productions of the silent era. These materials had been sitting unused for nearly a decade, taking up valuable warehouse space. Paramount executives made DeMille an offer that was too good to refuse. They told him he could use all of these existing costumes and sets completely free of charge, which would allow him to create the ancient world setting he needed without spending a fortune on new materials. DeMille jumped at the opportunity, and his production team went through the stored items to see what could be repurposed for the new film. The costumes from the Ten Commandments, which depicted ancient Egypt and biblical times, were modified and adapted to represent ancient Rome instead. The sets were similarly reworked to create the palaces, streets, and public spaces of Nero's Rome. This creative recycling not only saved the production enormous amounts of money, but also helped maintain the visual grandeur that audiences expected from a DeMille picture. The fact that costumes originally made for a film about Moses and the Israelites ended up clothing the Romans and Christians in The Sign of the Cross is a fascinating example of Hollywood resourcefulness during economically desperate times, proving that necessity truly is the mother of invention. Fact 11. Charles Laughton made Frederick March extremely uncomfortable. The working relationship between the two lead actors in The Sign of the Cross was marked by significant tension that had nothing to do with their performances. Frederick March, who played the Roman prefect Marcus Superbus, later revealed that his co-star Charles Laughton made him extremely uncomfortable throughout the entire production. Laughton, who was gay, apparently developed an attraction to March and made his feelings known in ways that the heterosexual actor found deeply unsettling. Years after the film was completed, March spoke candidly about the experience with writer Lawrence Quirk, explaining that Lawton's behavior on set was a constant source of anxiety for him. The specific issue that bothered March most was that Lawton would repeatedly try to look up his toga during filming. Since the costumes for the Roman characters were short tunics that left the legs exposed, this created awkward situations where March felt Lawton was taking advantage of the wardrobe to make inappropriate advances. March admitted that Lawton always made him feel nervous and uncomfortable, especially during scenes where they had to work closely together. Despite this uncomfortable dynamic behind the scenes, both actors remained professional enough to deliver strong performances that showed no signs of the tension between them. March's discomfort speaks to the different attitudes toward sexuality that existed in Hollywood during this era, when being openly gay carried significant professional and personal risks. Lawton himself was in a complicated marriage with actress Elsa Lanchester that was reportedly arranged partially to hide his homosexuality from the public, making the situation even more complex for everyone involved in the production. Fact 12. DeMille hired 4,500 extras to combat depression unemployment. During the production of The Sign of the Cross in November of 1932, Cecil B. DeMille made a deliberate effort to help struggling performers who were suffering through the worst year of the Great Depression. He hired an astonishing 4,500 extras to fill the massive arena scenes that depicted the Roman Colosseum, creating one of the largest casting calls in Hollywood history up to that point. This wasn't just about making his film look spectacular with enormous crowds, though that was certainly part of it. DeMille was acutely aware of the desperate economic conditions facing actors and performers throughout Hollywood and across the entire country. Unemployment was rampant, and people in the entertainment industry were particularly hard hit as theaters closed and productions were scaled back or canceled entirely. DeMille later reported that the situation was heartbreaking, saying that unemployed actors would lie in wait for him wherever he went, hoping for any opportunity to work. He claimed he had heard more hard luck stories during those months than anyone else in Hollywood. The extras were paid approximately $10 a day, which may not sound like much, but during the Depression, this was meaningful income that could help feed a family and pay rent. DeMille kept casting lists from his previous films and made sure his casting directors called every actor on those lists before hiring new people, trying to spread the work around to as many performers as possible. Motion Picture Magazine documented his efforts in an article about how DeMille was defying the Depression by providing employment opportunities on such a large scale, making The Sign of the Cross not just a film production, but also a significant relief effort for struggling performers. Fact 13. DeMille refused to cut the lesbian dance scene. One of the most infamous scenes in The Sign of the Cross is the Dance of the Naked Moon, performed by a character named Ancaria, who is described as the most wicked and talented woman in Rome. In the scene, Ancaria performs an erotic, suggestive dance intended to seduce Mercia, the virtuous Christian woman, in an attempt to corrupt her. The dance was filled with writhing movements and sexual innuendo that made it clear this was a lesbian seduction scene, which was shocking even by pre-code standards. Will H. Hayes, who ran the Hayes office that was supposed to regulate film content, was deeply troubled by this sequence and demanded that Cecil B. DeMille remove it from the film entirely. Hayes approached DeMille directly and asked what he planned to do about the controversial dance scene. DeMille's response was short, profane, and absolutely final. He told Hayes he wasn't going to do not a damn thing about it, making it clear the scene would remain in the picture exactly as filmed. The dance stayed in the original theatrical release, though DeMille's defiance had consequences. Many local censor boards across the country ended up cutting the scene from prints shown in their jurisdictions, so whether audiences saw it depended on where they lived. Despite these local cuts, the scene became one of the most talked about and notorious moments in pre-code cinema history. Interestingly, some exhibitors who kept the scene in their prints believed it would go over the heads of most audience members, assuming people wouldn't understand the lesbian implications, the dance. Of the Naked Moon remains a defining example of pre-code Hollywood's willingness to push boundaries before strict censorship enforcement began. Fact 14. A Way-Wado-to-2 prologue was added in 1944. When The Sign of the Cross was re-released in 1944, more than a decade after its original premiere, Cecil B. DeMille made a radical decision to add completely new footage that had nothing to do with the original story. He created an entirely new 9-minute prologue set during World War II that featured American bomber planes flying over the ruins of ancient Rome on their way to a mission. The prologue showed soldiers in one of the planes having a conversation that drew direct parallels between the tyrannical Emperor Nero from the original film and Adolf Hitler, who was leading Nazi Germany at the time. This new sequence was DeMille's way of making the film feel relevant and topical to audiences living through the war, suggesting that the struggle against tyranny and persecution was timeless and ongoing. The prologue was completed in March of 1944 at a cost of between $100,000 and $125,000, which was a substantial investment considering the entire original film had been made for only $650,000. The new footage featured actor Stanley Ridges in a prominent role, even though he had not appeared anywhere in the original 1932 version. At the end of the re-release version, DeMille also added a short epilogue showing the American bombers flying back to North Africa after completing their mission successfully. For many years, this 1944 version with the war prologue was the only version available to audiences, and people watching the film had no idea they were seeing a heavily modified edition rather than DeMille's original vision from 1932. Fact 15. Sets were built with no sides. One of the most ingenious cost-saving tricks used in The Sign of the Cross involved the way production designer Mitchell Leisen constructed the sets for the film. Leisen, who would later become a successful director in his own right, devised a clever system using miniatures and matte paintings combined with strategically placed, full-sized practical elements. The key to his approach was that the sets were built with only the parts that would be directly visible to the camera when shooting straight on, meaning there were no sides to any of the structures. When actors needed to walk into a scene, Leisen would build full-sized ramps and steps that led into the painted backgrounds and miniature sets, creating the illusion of depth and grandeur. However, if anyone had looked to the left or right of these ramps and steps, they would have seen absolutely nothing, just empty studio space where the rest of the set should have been. This meant that the camera operators had to position their shots with extreme precision, shooting exactly head-on to maintain the illusion. Any angle that showed the sides of the supposed buildings or structures would have immediately revealed that they didn't actually exist beyond what was directly in front of the camera. This technique required careful planning and choreography to make sure actors entered and exited through the correct spaces and that the camera never moved in ways that would expose the trick. Despite these limitations, the sets looked absolutely convincing on screen, creating the impression of massive Roman palaces, grand public spaces, and elaborate architectural details that simply weren't there in three-dimensional reality. Leisen's innovative approach allowed The Sign of the Cross to maintain its epic visual scale while working within the severe budget constraints of Depression-era Hollywood.